So Wes, welcome back to CTO Confessions.
Thanks for having me back.
Brilliant. So I'm just going to tell the audience of why I said welcome back, because we've already done a podcast, which you may have listened to, and you haven't, please check it out. It'll be on the link on the page. But what happened was that Wes came back with a topic that we didn't quite catch in the previous podcast, and it kind of really caught my attention. My ears kind of picked up my eyes were opened wide. So this is what we're doing here. So Wes, tell us what that topic was.
Yeah, I'm gonna laugh, and I'm gonna lead with something I think is quite controversial, but I also think is something that is true. And so the statement is that the CTO and that role is actually dead. That it's not dying, it's truly dead. And if you aren't thinking like that or haven't, understanding it, we're already, we're way behind. And so that was kind of like the main genesis of all of this conversation, that we're going to have here is like understanding the CTO role. Kind of historically a little bit how we got here, and then also understanding what I mean by the CTO role being dead.
Yeah, good. It kind of worries me a little bit. Firstly, it worries me for you because I think about other people. You being a CTO and tech leader, what are you going to do? But also, selfishly, from a CTO confession point of view, I'm going to have to rename the podcast. Big problem.
Yeah, I certainly I think it's dead. It's not that the work is going to go away. I think the real thing that we're talking about here is that we have to start thinking about the shift in what's happening, with technology. You had asked me in the last, podcast, I think one of the conversations that we have is about AI. Certainly AI is influencing, everything today, at a much faster rate than we even thought about when we recorded the first podcast. There have been so many announcements since then, big announcements since then. So AI is just, continuing to change everything. But I think when you really look at it, where I'm getting at is let's step back a little bit and we'll talk about the CTO, and we'll also talk about the chief product officer. This is where I've been spending some time thinking about things and what these roles are and, what they've historically been and where we're going. So the first is kind of like, let's look at these two roles and what do they focus on, right? And so when you look at CTOs, we had to focus on all of the technical aspects of everything that was being built, right? So we had to worry about not only the software, we had to worry about the infrastructure that supported everything, the data layers, all of these different components that all involve different technologies along the way. So that's how we came about, because companies, what do companies do when they think about operational risk, right? And as we historically move to more like e-commerce and other systems that, companies depend on, those systems required a lot of technology. And so somebody needed to be responsible for that to de-risk it. That's our job, right? We have to make sure that things are scalable. We have to make sure that things are up and running. We have to make sure that, that at the end of the day, things are being done and developed kind of quickly, like you can't wait for things to happen slowly. It's not like mainframe days where like if there was a problem, you could say, oh, well, it'll be fixed in a month. Like that's not the answer anymore. You have to wait. You can't wait. Business moves really fast. And so you need to fix things quickly. You need to be able to support everything. If you look at a product officer, right, they're thinking about things entirely differently. They're thinking about users. They're thinking about the user, experience. They're thinking about, well, what can we do to bring more people to use our product? They're thinking about feedback loops. They're thinking about experimentation. Technology and product, though they have traditionally been put together, there's a bit of it where it's like everywhere I've seen in the industry, it's actually like we're kind of at odds with each other, right? Like we work on two different things that like yeah, they come together, but it's kind of a forced come together. It's not something that just naturally aligns and both sides are happy, right? Like you do a lot of coaching. I'm sure you talk to a lot of leaders, and a lot of the challenges that leaders face is working with other leaders, right? And a common friction point in a lot of companies is the CTO and the chief product officer are not in alignment or in agreement about a lot of different things. Like what should we do now? What should we do next? Where should we spend the dollars, right? Like technology, you need more resources to go build all of the things, right? Because you've got this giant list of things that are over here, but you also need resources to support everything. So I think, being a physicist, I start to think about there's a classical world, that we lived in. And I feel like we're on this dawning age of moving into a quantum mechanical world, if you will, which is then there's a lot of parallels there that I'll kind of draw in this conversation. But I think, the original kind of point that I started to think about was that, it's not always that CTOs and CPOs are in alignment. And when you start to think about where things are going, and that's where I started to come up with this idea that, the CTO is actually is dead.
Wow. Yeah. And that's fascinating. I hear this kind of contention between these two important roles. And as you're describing it, I was thinking, which is the tail, the tail wagging the dog, I mean, is it the CPO is asking of the CTO in the old way of doing things of this is what we need to do, and they're driving the direction, and the CTOs, they've got their kind of remit of stability and scaling and et cetera, and so there is this constant pushback. Have you ever seen any examples where that's actually worked well?
I haven't seen too many. I mean, obviously, successful companies make it work. Right. Successful companies have it where it's like there's a thing where it works, but like, is it naturally aligned? Does everything go really, really well? I think maybe a period where like social networks were being developed, but I could think of Twitter had like before it was taking off and it was called Twitter. There was the fail whale was the one where it was like there was a moment where the company then decided that like we have to change everything we need to do in order to scale, in order to support the demand that is coming, and like all of the users of the system. And so I think there was definitely a very public exposition on their part to say everything that they were doing from a technical perspective. And that was great. Like it was like that commitment to, building things and making them reliable and making them performant. It was great to see that actually happening in real time. But at the same time, it wasn't like they were announcing new product features, when that was happening, like what were they going to do next? Were they introducing messaging, direct messaging or anything like that? They weren't talking about new product features or anything like that at that time. So it just seems like when you're focused on the product side of the house, you're focused on feature, and then you get to a point where it's like, okay, well, now we've accumulated all of this technical debt, and so now we need to go focus on that. And when you do that, then the product people go away. They create more ideas for more features while you're, doing your things. So I can't think of too many instances, probably speaks more to me than it does the industry, but, like there aren't too many instances that jump to mind from my perspective, where it's like you've seen this great alignment, constantly between the product and technology, where they're just like moving in absolute unison and one is feeding off of the other. And it's this great natural, relationship from both sides.
So I see the importance of, I'm still stuck in the old times. I'm going to be really honest, and this is why I love conversations like this, because you're introducing a new kind of concept, a new perspective on where we're going, because we are in this liminal space. We're not in the liminal space. It's changed. Okay.
Yeah.
And one of the
overnight.
Yeah. And I think some of us are still, like me, for example, are still waking up to this, it's changed. It's quite funny because I actually did AI very early on. I think I might have mentioned it in the previous podcast, but I wish I'd have stuck in it, because I think I would have been, in a very good position right now. But I walked away from the whole kind of AI area, and we've kind of woken up to this whole new paradigm shift. So some point, this kind of CTO, CPO role has become I think maybe it has been always contentious, but it's become very contentious now. Various reasons, and then to add to the mix, AI has come in and entered the scene. You know, like a very very present actor on the stage. Okay, and it's kind of so. Is that blurring the lines even further, or rather making the lines even more contentious?
Yeah, I think this is you're on the right track here of where I've been thinking about it, is that, you know, as we've gotten better at the technology, right? And you look at, like, originally we talk about that classical world where, you know, where was the role of the CTO coming from? You know, now you look at, like, all the progress that's actually been made. Think about just even in the systems of, like, how much more reliable they are, you know, than they were 10 years ago. Right? It's like you've got incredible platform as a service that's happening now, right? Like if an AWS goes down, like that's not a daily occurrence. That's a once every few years, you know, type situation. And you think about like DNS issues that used to happen on the regular, you know, now it's just like, it's like a global news event if something happens, right? So you've got all of this amazing technology that is now making it so that these platforms are so reliable. You've got all the amazing technology that makes it so that, like, your services are up and running. It's easy to deploy them, right? So like all of the things that we spent, you know, literally a decade building, all of these deployment pipelines, and like, how do we go from code to production? All of these things we've been building and making it so much better over the last decade. You've now got this kind of like baseline where it's like, well, what do you focus on? In the last podcast, we talked about burden a little bit, and we said that, you know, one of the things I always tell my teams is that, like, you're just shifting the burden to other places. You introduce a new framework, you gain something here, you've shifted the burden to something else. And then, you know, one of the things that has come up in my conversations is that AI is kind of reducing the cognitive load that, like, software developers, you know, have to focus on. You know, I can remember when I got started in coding, you had a book in front of you. It was like, sure, you know, the O'Reilly books were like the amazing things, right? Like they were so informative. It was just like, I remember collecting them. I was just like, anything that I could get my hands on, I would get those O'Reilly books and I would study them and learn them. But you would think about the amount of time it would take to like get that information, understand it, be able to implement it. You know, now with AI, you know, it's crazy because, like, I'm learning Swift, for example. You know, like I haven't built a native application, you know, before, and so now I'm doing that as part of the, you know, the company that I'm starting. And I just started to think about, like, oh, wow, the time to learn and the barrier to entry, right? We've now entered this kind of quantum mechanical world where it's like, yes, that electron can tunnel through the barrier. There isn't that huge wall of lack of information or lack of setup. Like, everything's available to you at your fingertips, and AI makes it even easier to learn, right? And I think it was kind of interesting. I think it was even Microsoft's CPO recently came out and said that, you know, the most important skill anymore isn't coding. It's going to be able to, you know, guide and shape the software kind of through like product editing. I think with the words that were used. And it's kind of fascinating where it's like, okay, do we have traditional software development? You know, what does it mean to do software development in the, you know, world of AI? You have Cursor and, you know, now you got Copilot, right? These tools, you're not writing all the if then else statements anymore. You're not worried about the semantics of like the for each loop. You're not worried about, you know, the semantics of how do I put a class together. You're taking what's in your head and you're describing it. And then those, you know, that description is then turned into the semantics of the code itself. And so it's really interesting because now it's like you get into more innovation that is capable. Different types of people can contribute to that innovation. Again, we had a barrier before, whereas like, why was the product person talking to software developers? It was because it was impossible to do both at the same time, right? If you were an expert in product, learning and understanding users, you know, that has a certain amount of cognitive load and amount of time that it takes to get to that point, to understanding the users and understanding what their needs are. And there was no way you could turn around and then go and actually build the product. Think about it now. Is that still true? like you've already got stories like First Round Capital started a new series. It's a great one. It's about applying AI, basically. So they're like, forget discovering AI. It's already about applying AI. And, the first company that they did an in-depth on was Shopify. And one of the things that you if you read that article, and I don't want to give it all away, I think everybody should go and read that series, is that they've now had people start to develop data products in the marketing department. So it's like the marketers are out there. They're not coming and talking to the product person who then goes to the software engineer, right? They're using AI and they're using their own understanding and context, and having that barrier of access to data having been removed, because now you got MCPs, you got natural language processing, you've got all of this intelligence. Now they can contextually describe what they need, and you've got a tool that can produce it for them, and crazy can actually display it in amazing ways, right? Like do all of that. So that's where it's like, yeah, AI is really starting to blur the lines, where it's like, you could be more controversial. Is software developer really a role anymore? Like I said, Microsoft's already thinking about it as product editing. Is it product engineering? It's not software. We're not worried about the bits and bytes anymore. We're not worried about the if then else and the semantics of the code. We're now worried about how do we take, user requirements and distill them into the right context to build the product.
That's a really interesting term that you've introduced here, the product editing. And I mean, that is the shift, isn't it? As you describe, the capabilities of people being able to bring their problems or their desires or the outcomes that they want and be able to create them is, the barriers just reduced right down. I'm trying to think of an analogy where this has happened in another industry where engineers were, I'm thinking engineers, but engineers were doing X, Y, and Z, and suddenly that was not needed anymore. Their role had to evolve into something else because that thing that they were doing now is just kind of out of the box.
Yeah, well, I think about, let's maybe jump back to something which is tool crafting, right? And so building tools, for example, and how you do molding and things like that. Think about the evolution of technology of like 3D printing. And how, we started with really, really large CNC machines, right? And the technology behind a CNC machine, literally, I can remember when I was a kid, I grew up in Ohio. Ohio Northern University would host a lot of us bright high school students, and we'd go over to these programs. And I remember walking into the mechanical engineering section of Ohio Northern University, and they had an entire room that was devoted to this ginormous CNC machine. And they were breaking down the software that was written in assembly language in order to give it the instructions in order to do the grinding down to build tools for other engineering efforts. And now when you think about it, we literally have 3D printers that can, replace casting and replace forging, because you can just give it a hunk of metal and it'll go and carve it out. And that is kind of the thing where it's like that industry has changed. Even further back, I can think, my dad, he worked in the steel industry for 23 years, back in the 70s and 60s, 70s and 80s. And you look at that industry and how much it had changed. Like they'd made what were called steel rolls. So when you get sheets of steel, how do you get those perfect sheets of steel? Well, you put them between these heavy rolls, and then you take that hot molten steel and run it through there, and then that's how you get it. And so how do you build a roll, that can withstand the heat and do all of the things? That eventually changed so much so that like my dad's company went out of business. Teledyne High Steel was gone because they didn't evolve, because the technology had changed. So I think we've seen seismic shifts. If you want to talk about economies, we can talk about the industrial economy changing to the information economy, changing to the social economy. And now kind of the thing that I've been thinking in my head is that we truly live in an innovation economy. And so you have to start thinking like an innovator through all of this. And then that's how you evolve from like maybe being a software developer to, a product developer. And maybe the CTO is literally, we have to shift and we have to start thinking about product a lot more, especially as all of these technologies, become more ubiquitous.
Fascinating. Yeah, I mean, it's. I can imagine audience listening to this. The software engineers out there, the CTOs out there, the product owners out there. Is the penny dropping that this is actually happening? It's happening, but has the penny dropped in people's minds?
I don't know if it's happened in people's minds, but you're definitely seeing it in businesses, already, where you're starting to see a lot more of, chief product officers. And let's look at startups. Let's go look at the startup. If we look at startups, a lot of people who came out of business school, what was the first thing that they would do? They would always go look for a technical co-founder. Right? Because the technology was something that you needed. Even in the days of like building e-commerce and, web products and all of that stuff, you needed a technical founder, in order to actually bring your idea to market. Is that true today? I mean, we've already heard stories of, what was it recently? There was a story that came out last week. I think it was a kid who was 13 or 15, developed a game on Roblox, and sold it for millions already. So you're already talking about, teenagers who are enabled through the power of AI, right? Because Roblox is given, like the AI power to develop new games as part of their platform. And as a result of that, you had, a 13 or 15-year-old go out and build a game, and then sold it for millions. If you're starting a company now, do you have to have a technical founder? I don't think that you do. You need to really, truly focus on, who your customer is. And you can now spend more time focusing on that customer because now you have tools that can get you to places that you've never been able to do without having the technology, kind of resources available to help you get there. I mean, think about, I mentioned, Cursor and, Copilot and, VS Code, but think about, Replets and Lovables, of the world. And there's a lot of, detractors from them saying, well, you can only get so far. But come on, they're going to continue to get better and better too. Right. And so the ability to, if you have an idea and you want to produce a mobile app, your barrier to entry is a lot less than it was even a year ago. And that's going to continue to be so. And I think you're going to see a lot more of, founders who are using less resources on the technical side in order to bring their ideas to bear. And so the call that I'm trying to get for like the CTOs and the software engineers of the world is that like our call to action is that we've got to start thinking about this transition, not as if it's going to happen. It's already happening. And we need to like transition ourselves to be ready for it and start to shift our careers. Because if we don't, we're going to get left behind. To bring back that analogy, from my dad, when my dad's foundry closed, he had a group of friends. And so there were a number of friends who stayed in the industry, so to speak. They kept trying to look for manufacturing jobs. They didn't want to train themselves to do something else, right? It's hard. You've done something your entire life, and now all of a sudden you've got somebody telling you need to go do something else. And here are the training and the tools that are available to you. But it takes a lot of will to want to be able to change, right? Like our mode is to kind of stay in what our comfort zone is. Well, out of the kind of 10, 11 guys that my dad knew, my dad and one other person went and took advantage of those training opportunities. And as a result of that, my dad had a second career in education and he became a teacher. And his other friend had changed and moved into sales. The other folks didn't change. And they struggled and they bounced from, job to job. And then actually the jobs that they had, they went from, specialization to lower and lower, type jobs because their skill sets were outdated. There weren't those opportunities. And that's why I've been thinking about this a lot as well, is that, as we, move from the industrial to the information economy, and now, then we had the kind of like the social e-commerce economy. Now we're moving into this innovators economy. I think it's people are going to have to realize that maybe some of the jobs that, that they've had such an easy time getting before are going to be harder. I think it's going to be harder for leaders to find traditional, CTO roles. I think it's going to be much more difficult for software engineers to find the traditional software engineering role. And that's a shift for them because they basically learned how to code. And I can remember I had a friend said that, it's like, I'll just go out and hold up a sign on the street. I know Rails, Ruby on Rails when it was hot, 10, 15 years ago. And they would have had like 10 offers, from startups or other companies. And so, you have a group of people who have, grown up in that world and so to speak, and now it's shifting. And if we don't change with it, I worry that we're going to be like, the friends that my dad had that, are going to get left behind.
And yeah, coming back to this term that you mentioned here is a kind of product editing. And I think everybody, all these roles need to get into that. So it seems to be pointing in a direction. The game has changed. Now, one of the things that I know back in my days of software and electronics is get to the market quick. Okay, so there was a speed thing. Okay, it was almost kind of like output. It wasn't outcomes; it was output. The outcomes is more the kind of thing in the space now. So, what is the thinking that's different now in the space that people really need to embrace, and what thinking do they need to let go of?
Yeah. Well, maybe I'll challenge, Zuckerberg, because we've had this idea a lot in technology. It's like move fast and just break things. And I think to your point, there's a whole focus and Agile has been a part of this. There's been a lot of thinking over the last 15 years of just velocity, faster. And at least in my mind, I think that as you start to learn more about AI, it becomes much more about context. And so I think we're going to start to see a lot more about moving with intention, not just moving with speed, is going to be the thing that actually wins. If you just move with speed and you have an idea and you want to get it out there, it's true. You need to certainly experiment and so forth. But I think what we're getting at is that you can be a lot more intentional, understanding your users and learning from your users, and then go and develop a more well-formed idea rather than like, here's just idea, let's get it out there very minimal and start breaking it. Your users are more experienced. As users start to adopt AI more, they're going to ask more contextual questions that are going to be deeper. And so I think that's kind of the thing in my mind of where product is shifting, is it has to be much more intentional than it was before in the past. And you're starting to see that again, where people who are in other parts of the company, if we just look in a company and we say, hey, internally, we're now giving people the ability to develop their own products. They're not doing it necessarily with speed in mind, right? They're very intentional. They have a particular problem that they're trying to solve, a visualization that they need, access to data so that they can answer a particular question, but they're very intentional. And the speed just goes out of it because now we have tools that, like I said, make this, so much more easy to do than we had in the past. So I think that's kind of the biggest part of thinking, is that it's not just about speed. You have to think with intention. And then if you're thinking with intention, that means that as software engineers, as technical folks, we need to understand the users of anything that we're building more than we've ever, done. And obviously, better software engineers, you have an understanding of users and so forth. But now more than ever, I think you just have to start thinking like a product manager, and less so as a software engineer.
So this is kind of upstream change that needs to be happening. There's obviously people in the mix, right? People like, I'm just going to put myself in that mix as well. We're already in the mix. We're in the space. We're involved in tech. We're involved in, various projects. I can't help thinking about the people that are coming through, the people that are doing business studies, people who are doing marketing, people maybe that are doing, software engineering as well. What do you think needs to happen upstream to get them ready for this? So when they land, they're not going to have this huge disappointment or shock.
Yeah, I think the first is to embrace that AI is not just coming, it's here. I think it's starting to be heard is that AI is now part of your job. I think, even 6, 9 months ago when you were using ChatGPT, you were kind of ridiculed for it because it was like, oh, you need that tool to write an email? That's kind of silly. I think that perception is the one that is being challenged the most. It has to be put out the window. You are augmented and you're so much more powerful if you start to use these tools. So number one piece of thinking is that accept AI. It's here. It's still, and it's improving, like I said, at faster rates. I can remember hallucinations was a conversation topic even 9 months ago. It's like that is going way down, right? Like the hallucination topic, yes, it still happens, but it's just getting so much better as you provide the appropriate context, around it and ask it good questions. So I think that's number one, understanding AI is it. Number two is thinking about context and how much awareness of the problem. I think so. It kind of goes back a little bit to school. Remember, like when you were in school, there were always the people who just wanted the answer. They didn't want to understand how they got the answer. They just wanted the answer to get credit on the homework. Okay. I think we're moving into a world where it's like, if you understand how you got that answer, you're actually going to be far more successful. And thinking of it from that perspective, you now have a tool that, provided the right context, can give you so much information. And we're now going to, as kind of like the product folks, give you access to the data and reduce all of those. I don't know if it's reducing the barriers. I think the barriers are still kind of there. There's still technical hurdles. I think what we're actually doing is, to use the quantum mechanical analogy here, is we're giving you enough energy to cross through that barrier. You're going to tunnel through it like you've never been able to do before because of AI. And so I think for all those folks upstream, they actually can be more forceful in demanding more and not accepting that, oh, I just got a dashboard that's over here in Tableau that kind of gives me an answer, right? Like you can start demanding more because other companies are already doing more than just that. You should be able to like literally get used to being on a prompt. Prompts are here to stay. They're not going anywhere. So understanding how to contextually describe your problem, really truly understanding your problem, and then also raising the bar, demanding more from your kind of product and technology teams so that you can actually get the answers that you need. I think that's the kind of thing that the folks that are upstream, I think it's a little hard for the CEO, but like for leaders as well, like as executive leaders, you're going to have to get ready to be a little bit more self-service. Right? Like you're not going to have an excuse anymore of saying, hey, person, can you go and generate this report for me? Right? Like some of that will happen. But if you're at a startup and you're a startup leader, you're not going to have that excuse of waiting for the analytics team for an answer, coming forward. So you need to change as a leader to think about how are you going to be more at the forefront of getting the answers that you need. And again, it just comes down to embracing AI, providing that context, truly understanding the problem, and then demanding more, from the teams around you.
We're dropping speed. We're getting more intentional. We're thinking more about what is it. We're a lot more focused on the product editing. I love that term. Actually, we're becoming product editors in some form, and I guess there's some specializations in that heading in that direction. What do we do? The people that are in the mix now, okay? We do need to change our mindset. We do need to change our thinking, and we need to get intentional about what is it we're trying to achieve. And that includes the business as well. This isn't just about the technology function within the organization, but the other business functions out there.
One of the first things that you talked about is, well, what do we do, right? So like if you're a CTO or you're a software engineer, like, what do you do? I think all of us have already gotten into, playing with the AI tools, for sure. So that is a given. And I think as, developers, so many people are using Cursor, they're using Copilot, experiment with the lovables and replets if you haven't already done so for like your little side project ideas, those types of things. But I think if I'm a leader, I start have to thinking about, well, what are kind of the makeup and the function of my teams, going forward. How do I, change things? Yes, you've got to support legacy technology, but do you? Can you set up agents to start to support those types of things? It's like, do you have to worry about the uptime as much, on your systems and services, or should you be like building, AI agents to help you, with those types of things? And actually the the products are changing as well, right? I'm sure Heroku's out there already making it so that, their stuff is all agentic and you don't even have to worry about it. It's like you already get high uptime as it is, but you're going to have other things like fixing performance issues before you even know that they happen. Here's a bad query, right? Like you wrote a terrible query and it's already optimized and been fixed, before you know it. But how do you get to that? Which is, again, thinking about the makeups of your teams, and then also thinking about like, what are the skill sets that you want from your team? So I think there's going to have to be a bit of training that is happening, just like anything, just like when even 15 years ago, when Ruby on Rails came out and we started to change, how web applications were done. All of the CGI Perl programmers before, even when we did CGI Perl, had to go and start to learn, the PHPs and the Ruby on Rails. That took some training effort. That was there. Not everybody can just do that on their own. So you have to commit to be, AI first, and then also being able to train your people and give them the space to do that and learn about it. You're going to get these benefits later. So take a little bit of trade-off, right now, to spend 2-3 months getting everybody up to speed on these tools and technologies moving forward, so that, again, it's like compounding interest rate. Little investment now, 1 year from now, you're going to have, quite a return on it. I think it's interesting too. I think another shift is going to be, it's not just going to be feature, drop, right? Like we just put features out there and then see which one sticks. So changing the way that we think about, product management and how we learn about what our users' actual needs are. Right. I think that there's an old, there's an older meme out there that shows, like your phone, and it's like, all the buttons and cameras and all of this stuff on it. We'll just keep throwing stuff on it. We'll go from one camera lens to having, 20 camera lenses. That'll be better. You can get sucked into that. And I think, again, it goes back to being intentional, thinking, just break everything down that you do and how you interact with your customers, and understanding them even better, understanding what their expectations are, understanding what their needs are coming from AI, understanding that they're better educated because of AI, right, than they ever were. They're going to be more demanding than they ever were. And so, again, if you don't have a good product, you're going to, get left behind. So focusing on intention and just revisiting everything that you do. I think as like a side project, I think, I started to talk to some people, and you've been involved in that conversation about Agile. We have to think about the Agile process, that we have, put together. And I think we need to take a step back and, think about, how do we do the Agile process in the age of AI, where we have, better customers and more demanding customers, and we have a different skill set and different tooling, than we've had in the past. So I think those are a few things that are going to come out there, but again, it's just going to be a lot of learning. I think is a key focus of everything that you have to focus on. And then when it comes to burden, it's just thinking about, where have you been spending your cognitive load? What have you been focused on? I think, if I a CTO now, I would be really truly going through my entire staff and saying, where are they spending their time? Or, what are the things that, they're like losing the ability to innovate because they have cognitive load to do something. And then how do we enable removing that cognitive load and shifting the burden from that to how do we innovate? I think one of the bigger lines that I started to think about, and in this, is that if we're in an innovator's economy, then we have to treat innovation as capital. And if you're treating innovation as capital, you're going to use it very differently than if it's just something that you're not thinking about, right? Like you start to plan for it, just like you budget, for certain things. You have to start budgeting your innovation and where you're going to spend, the time to do those things. And that means that you have to start reducing cognitive loads. You have to, refactor your processes and, do them in a way that enables people to, focus on being innovative.
They have that headspace to be able to focus on those things. And I can imagine that not everybody is going to fit into that very well. I guess this kind of speaks to that some people aren't going to be able to change, and they're going to have to adapt in their own way. Okay, I don't want to use the word left behind, but they're going to be left to do other things. Being a software engineer in the past, I'd go to a bit of software and I kind of knew I needed to write nice functions, I needed to encapsulate stuff, I needed to create unit tests, I needed to make sure that, the right bits were being poked, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So it's kind of quite clear. Now I'm having to be truly cross-functional because I'm not only just going into understanding the product, I'm going into marketing, I'm understanding the customer, I need to connect with what that is. So it's a multifaceted shift and focus for everybody.
We talk about the developers. Let's use the right terminology. If we think about the product developers, right? If you're coming into this, you're going to have to learn a lot more about user experience than perhaps you have, in the past, right? Where maybe you relied on a product manager to help you, decipher that user experience. Well, maybe now it's you who's involved in that, right? Just as much as the product manager is now getting into using these tools, the Lovables and Replets of the world and going out there and demonstrating their ideas. The flip side needs to happen is that you have to get into user experience. You have to maybe even get into product positioning. Like, what does it mean to position your product out there in the marketplace? No longer can you just, think about relying on other folks on the team, because again, it becomes that context and that intention are really important. Learn what makes people care about your product. Why do they truly care? Why are they so vested that they're actually paying you to solve this problem for them? Get that much closer to the actual users of the system. I mean, these were all good practices, from before. It's not so much that it's an innovative idea. It's just that your focus is going to shift from being aware of those things to that's actually part of your day-to-day job as a product developer or product engineer, versus where before, just software engineer, you may have just been implementing an algorithm, or you may have just been, writing a lot of code to move, data from here to there. Those types of things will still exist, much less so, but, to really be on the forefront, that's there. And then I also just think for companies and, and even boards, like if you want to go to larger companies, what shift are they going to have? It's like, don't default to hiring a CTO just because the org chart says so. Right? Like it really kind of becomes of like, I kind of see this idea of the CPO and the CTO merging at best and actually being replaced, more of like by a chief innovation officer, right? Because you're focused on innovation. That's what your product should be. Your product should be innovative, at the very least. And so I think, again, the roles that we've had in the past are very specific to the tools that they used or the methodologies that they used. And now it's like, well, innovation doesn't care in the age of AI. And I think those are the parts where people's roles are going to change. And then we have to think about the structure of companies and how the leadership is actually, put together too. Like, what are you going to be incentivized before? What are you going to be responsible for as a leader? As you report to the board? Are you going to be sitting there saying that like, oh, our uptime was, 4 nines, like that was an accomplishment, 10 years ago. It's just a given now. It's the baseline. And so it's just understood. And so you have to like think about what that is going to be like in the future because of everything that we're moving toward.
As you described this, my mind went back to this kind of idea back in the day when we talked about full stack engineers, these kind of unicorns that were T-shaped people, and then there were pie-shaped people, and then there were combs, and knew the full stack. That's becoming irrelevant almost now because everybody can, but there's a different type of stack.
Yes. I think it's different. I think one of the things that is I start to think about it, and it's really, my like personal experience in working with all of this, is that I can remember a long time ago, early in my career, I'm sorry, I'm bouncing around a little bit here, but I'll start and ground myself. I can remember early in my career, I was a director. I was responsible for, an engineering group, and we were responsible for, infrastructure. And then the company decided to hire a CTO. VP of engineering left, and we were hiring a CTO. And I can remember the candidate started to say, well, everything is based off of, your enterprise data model. Everything is based off of the data model. Everything that we do is around the data. And I thought that was pretty pressing at the time. And of course, over time, we've definitely heard, like data is king, right? We're now making decisions based off of data. And I think what's interesting is that with everything that we're doing with all of these tools is we're both reducing the barrier in terms of access to that data, and we're also giving people more energy to get to the data in ways that they didn't have available to them before, right? I'm using my quantum mechanical analogies here. But it really is true. So the shift is part of that. It's like you've already got it where you can start to describe your data, and it goes through and it'll create whatever the table structure is and whatever, database that you want to store it in, right? You don't have to think about the semantics of the GraphQL query that you're putting together anymore, because you can tell AI what you want and it'll construct it for you. And then you'll see the result, and then you'll iterate until you get what you want. So there still is a stack. You still go from the data to the presentation. It's just different because now you're focused on the context and the usage and what your users want from that data. The tools are slightly different. And then the capabilities of how it's used, it's like we started with databases and we started with SQL. Then we moved to, services and APIs, right? We're going to give you APIs. And, so then we developed REST APIs. And then we said, well, REST isn't so great because that's pretty prescriptive. And, then we created GraphQL. And yes, a lot of people spend a lot of time learning all of those details. The beauty of AI is that it removes that barrier, right? Like literally you could put a prompt in front of someone and then all of that mess is just gone. And it just comes down to here's the data that I want and here's how I want it presented. So I think the full stack is there. You're going from visualization all the way down to the data. It's just an entirely different way of thinking about it. And again, it's the context of the problem. You're not just looking for the answer. You're not worried about just, to use a really lame analogy of I just want the answer. You're not just worried about the okay, it's at this pixel where I'm putting, the display. You're actually thinking about how is that, display powered, and what's inside it. And I think that's the shift that people are going to have to, endure, so to speak, if they want to continue in this, because again, the front end engineering, all of this stuff is moving, the visualizations, all of that is coming at a much different and easier path than it was before. So understanding everything, what the data is, but then the context are going to be really the most important parts. So there's a stack, it's just different.
Yeah. My mind went to this kind of idea, the kind of higher dream of where we're heading and the ideas that you've presented here. And I thought about the full stack CEO, the CEO that has a knowledge about all these different aspects of product development and the marketing and the understanding the customer. Obviously, I mean, that's the kind of higher dream, but the executives and leaders in the organization are going to have this kind of stack where they are focused on that. The other stuff is just out of the box now. I feel, though I'm not working in space, it's not quite there yet, but you can correct me on that. But, there is going to be a day where you really don't need to worry about the architecture and things like that, maybe. I don't know. What do you think?
I 100% agree. I think there's, it used to be you hired a CTO to make all these technical choices for you, what your data storage was going to be, what your framework was going to be for your services, all of this type of stuff. I think that, now you're going to describe what you need, and then some decisions are going to, automatically be made. I can envision a world where we're using AWS, for example, and I go into a prompt in AWS and say, hey, I'm starting something new, and it just automatically builds the entire, infrastructure for me. But yeah, I totally agree. We're not there yet, but this concept of you being the product developer, and being the data developer as well, right? Building the data products around all of these things, right? Because one of the key things that like just in the old data analytics world is that you have to build so many dashboards because everybody looks at the same piece of data differently, right? So it's like if you have a funnel, funnel metric of, like say where customers are dropping off and, the usage of your product, the CEO looks at it one way, marketing looks at it one way, the sales team looks at it this way. It's the same data, but they all want to see different slices of it at different places. And so that's why you had to develop, your 100 different dashboards to get all of the nuances in there. Now that's gone, right? Because people will be able to describe their context and then the visualizations and then the kind of like research and places where they're going to go. That's where they're going. So yeah, on the leadership side, you're going to have to think about, how are you also going to be a little bit of this engineer, if you will, but from a different, perspective. But I do think that's coming across for all organizations. Shopify's out there on the bleeding edge right now. But to be competitive, in order to stay in business, this is what you're going to have to do if you're operating in a legacy company to be successful.
Yeah. And I've not used the tool, so I'm coming in as a bit of a newbie. You're dragging me wanting to get into this kind of idea of a full stack CEO. Okay, I would love to be that. That's kind of this ability to be able to use the tools and have the data and be able to manipulate it.
You'll be founding your own company in no time, just like me. I've stepped out. Now I'm a founder.
So, and the engineer in me is thinking is that how you wield AI and what you ask of it is very, it sets it off in a direction and it creates a context and it generates what, if it has good context and you give it good direction, it will create what you want, okay, within its capabilities. So there's almost a layer now of the art of describing what you need or what you want or what the outcome is. So is there any innovations around that? Are there languages that are describing what we need, or is it literally a command line and we're having to give it scripts and lots of descriptions? What does that look like?
I think that the thing that will happen is that, like, we've talked a lot about context, right? You have to give it context so that it stays on track and it doesn't disappear. I think that is the area that will improve because, again, it's learning, right? It's learning from you as it's educating you and giving you something. But I think you touched on something which is really important, which is the outcome. The human element in all of this is you're still going to have to distill, like, did I get the right, answer from what I put into it? And if I didn't get the right answer, what do I need to change, right, about the inputs to make it get to the right point? So that's where it's like, again, there's a lot of people who think AI is about replacement. I think about AI as, augmentation is much greater than replacement, right? It's going to make us more powerful. It's going to give us the ability to shift the burden from some of the things that we spend our cognitive load on to thinking about different things. But I do think that over time, the models will continue to get better. The LLMs will get better. You train them. And then the context, you don't have to provide as much. It will be able to infer a lot more as it goes in time. So again, we're very early. We're very nascent on all of this. But yes, your ability to, again, truly understand the problem. And I think that, like you said, as a founder, that's what you're doing, right? You're solving the problem that is an extreme pain point or that somebody else hasn't solved before. And that's where I think it's going to be really interesting in the startup world to see, where it's going. Like I'm in that position now as a founder of a company. I'm a founder of one right now. It's amazing what I've been able to do as just one person versus a year ago starting a company where, it's like, do I need a co-founder? You used to have to split responsibilities of doing all of these different things. Well, now I can use AI to help me do a lot of things that I couldn't before. But it comes from a really, really, really deep knowledge of what the problem is and what I'm trying to solve. I think in the last podcast, you'd asked me if I'd used my science background. And I do think that there's a bit of this where it's like a lot more people are going to be exposed to what it's like to be a researcher. Because when you're a researcher, you're solving a problem that nobody else has solved before, right? You're digging into it at its deepest level. And I think that That's what AI is getting us into a position of being able to do, is get to something at its deepest level, really truly understand it. So if you focus on the problem, not just the answer, and then have the ability to understand whether you're getting the right, response back, it's going to be extremely powerful. And these were nascent. Yeah. Think about how much has changed just in the last few months. And like that scale of speed is just going to keep getting better. And it's going to be amazing what people can do. Like, I'm excited about what I can do with it as a founder. Almost to the point of like, do I try and prove that like you could be a solo founder and do all of this stuff? And does it change the dynamics? Like in the past, I would have to raise money and then go hire a team, to build things. And it's like, and maybe I don't need to do that, because again, we already talked about how it's not about velocity, it's about intention. And it's about that true understanding of what your users are doing. So it's a different world. And, folks have to transform from it. I think, it's almost like a message. I see a lot of folks have been laid off in the software engineering world. I would challenge them, instead of just going out and saying, here's my skill set, and applying for jobs, in this is kind of fashion. If you haven't had a good response, start to think differently. Change yourself, get into these tools, contribute to an open source product, go take an idea, develop it, set yourself apart from everyone else who's just blindly sending a resume and hoping for a response. Network, get in the community, start to talk about that. You never know what your opportunity is going to be. I know it's harder to find a job as a software engineer than it's historically been. So do something different. Consider being a founder. Why not? It's like, if you've already been out of work for 3 months, it's like, consider being a founder, consider being a consultant with somebody. Like, take their idea, start to introduce AI to them, and like, say, hey, here's how I can help you. There's a lot of companies that have a lot of data pipelines that need a lot of work in order to do these types of things. Get creative. Don't just blindly apply to jobs and say, I've been doing this for a year. You're going to get left behind. I don't want to use that term, but I'm going to say it. You're going to get left behind. This is just like what happened when we went from the industrial to the information age. If you're not out there doing these things, you're not out there thinking differently, it's going to be a tough road.
Any tools that you would suggest people get? I imagine the tools are changing, the resources are changing all the time, but just help some of the people out there that might be inspired by, hopefully it's inspired by what you just said, to get on that ramp and start to kind of, get up that incline.
Yeah, well, Cursor's amazing. I think is a thing if you're into native applications. Xcode 26 is coming out. If you can get the beta version of Xcode 26, get into that. If you haven't used a Lovable or Replit yet, please go get out there and do it. There's some others, but Lovable just got $200 million of investment here recently. It's a pretty cool tool, what you can do. And understand that, think of it like this, like a long time ago, we had all these, web frameworks, you could generate code, and that's what it does. Like it not only generates the code, it starts to generate the interfaces for you, the visualizations for you. It does all of that. So instead of worrying about the pixel perfect and where you move things, you have to think about, well, how do I tell it to move that over there? How do I tell it that that's not the next screen that I want to go to? So shift your thinking, and start to use these tools if you haven't. And do anything you're doing. It's like, I can't imagine people aren't using at least Cursor or Copilot in VS Code. If you're not, start. Just do it. Pony up your $20 a month. The way I look at it is that I pay $20 a month for Cursor. I pay $20 a month for ChatGPT. So it's like, okay, I'm spending $60 a month to have powerful assistants, around me. And that's really where we need to think about. But yeah, try the Lovables, the Replits of the world, just to see that's what other users are going to, look for. It's not like, let's go buy this specific product and build this dashboard and, this kind of stuff. It's going to be, this is me describing what I want, and I want it.
It's really got me thinking about how that looks. So I'm intrigued. I'm going to get on that ramp and start traveling up that incline to build that skill set.
think about an app that you love using right now. Think about an app that you love using right now, and then use one of those tools to go build a mini version of it. Like, that's really what you should be doing. If you haven't done it already, you should be doing it, because that's where you're going to get exposed to so much if you haven't already. And it just really changes the way that you think. And just opens up a world of possibilities. And you're just like, it's like there's a corner of your mind that you don't even know that you have available to you yet. And when you start to get into those tools, it's just a very different way of thinking. And I can't describe it adequately enough until you try it. So that's really the simplest thing, is to just pick an app that you like and try and go, rebuild it, and enhance it and do it differently. And who knows, maybe you wind up having the next version of the product and you're up on the App Store and you're an accidental founder. That's the worst outcome that happens.
Great challenge, a very inspiring one. And I can't help following my normal pattern of the podcast, which is to ask you, from the Tech Genie, what would you wish for in the context of everything that we've spoken about?
That's a good one. I think that for right now, I still hear, I wish for two things. I wish for people to have the space in order to embrace and take on these new technologies. And I wish for the people who are struggling to find a job to find the courage to go out there and start to look at these tools and reach out for help. You don't just have to sit there and take that challenge on alone. Find me, talk to me. I'm happy to talk to people, happy to guide folks through it, leverage networks. Like I said, we are in truly an innovator's economy right now. And I think that's the thing. I know there's people out there who are really struggling, who have been at it for a long time trying to find a job. I know they got bills to pay and so forth. And so I just hope that they find the courage to get into these tools, to reinvent themselves. I know it's hard. I'm 55 years old. I feel like, I've reinvented myself several times, and I'm going through that transformation myself right now. It's not the easiest thing to do, but find the courage. And if you need the support, reach out and do it. And I would hope that the community is much more embracing of people to help bring them along so that they aren't left behind. So doing talks like this, getting involved. If you know somebody who's struggling, trying to find a job right now, check in on them. If you know a founder is out there and you haven't spoken to them in a while, just check in on everybody. I think that's a big wish. It's, it's exciting, but there's also a lot of people who are really struggling. So reach out to those folks and lend a hand.
Very human-centric wish there in that respect, and I felt that, and you're right. To find that time, to find that space, that headspace. Some of us have still got a job, and some of us, but to use that, to find that space to be able to do this transition or set ourselves up for it. So as we come to our final full stop, Wes, what's your final key takeaway? I feel like you've given loads of final key takeaways away. I'm going to ask you for one more. What is that one? What is it? What's the parting gift?
It's embrace the change. It's here, it's happening. And so is embrace the change and become a part of it. And I think the biggest thing is that let's make sure that this time that all of the good actors and all the good behavior come out of this, right? So let's do positive things with all of the technology and everything that's ahead of us, and let's be the force for using it for good, and making sure that we're holding others accountable for using it for good things.
What a beautiful note to finish on. Thank you for your time, Wes. It's been wonderful having you on again on CTO Confession.